BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Wednesday, time for the AMA. That's the Ask Me Anything, where I respond to your questions and comments. We go through the material together and we have a discussion. In this episode, I'm going to be focusing on your comments from Monday's episode, which was on the 1986 book Zodiac by Robert Graysmith. And as you see, this is part two. In part one, I did a walkthrough of the different Zodiac killer crimes, as well as talked about some of the early letters and cryptograms that were written by this serial killer from the 1960s. In this episode, I'm going to talk more about some analytical statements or hypotheses that are explored in the book, and this is an episode that was requested by one of the listeners. James requested a book discussion on Robert Graysmith's 1986 Zodiac. So if anybody has an idea for a future episode, you can put it in the comments section down below. If you want to send it to me privately, you can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And as always, please hit the like button and subscribe. So, firstly, because I'm going to be responding to your comments as well as discussing the book, we have one from River Prawn Pottery here who says, regarding Robert Graysmith, he may have taken certain creative liberties crafting his story, but I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm certain he has provided some very insightful information. Maybe a discussion about what he may have gotten right should happen. Well, River Prawn Pottery, I want to respond to this one first because I actually like the 1986 book so much more than I thought I would. Yes, it is a book that has been very heavily criticized for having a lot of half-truths and pieces of misinformation, and just to sum this up in one sentence, if anyone would like to read the entirety of the pieces of misinformation, there's a book called The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986, but I've already done my book discussion on that one, and I want to focus on the 86 book. What does Graysmith get right? The 1986 book is filled with quotations from people who were investigating the case. It's filled with insight from people other than Robert Graysmith. He's not just sitting down and writing his Zodiac theory. He's talking about the entire process, all of the different people who had first-hand connections to the story, such as Melvin Belli, the attorney, Nancy Slover, the dispatcher who spoke to the Zodiac, and he's sharing their ideas and putting it all together. And there are some insightful statements. I concluded the last episode by talking about a psychological profile that had been made from the killer, and I want to ask you guys this as a challenge question, because Robert Graysmith posed it in the book. Was the Zodiac killer an engineer? And actually the question he says is, was the Zodiac killer a British engineer? And my honest take on the subject is, the British part comes from using the term Happy Christmas instead of Merry Christmas. I've mentioned this a lot before in the past, and yes, Happy Christmas is said in the UK and in Australia. However, I don't think there's an ounce of evidence that suggests that the Zodiac was British. Instead, I think that he was just using a couple of different ways of phrasing things because he was a weird guy. He's not just going to be doing things conventionally. In fact, I think that the Zodiac probably would have been described as a weird and quirky guy by the people who knew him in his personal life. I think that Happy Christmas comes from Clement C. Moore's 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, which concludes with Happy Christmas to all and to all a good night. We all grow up with that in America. Now, as far as being an engineer goes, I don't think we have enough information to say that because the Zodiac is using very technical language, and he's demonstrating a very high understanding of things like, how about drawing out a bomb diagram? How about talking about radians and inches along the radians? But he could have learned that in so many other things, in so many other places, in so many other ways. The military, or just perhaps even having a job which requires him to read about this type of information as opposed to actually being an engineer, or maybe he's working for some type of corporation, so to speak. And here's another aspect of psychological profiling. The Zodiac was someone who was described in this book as most likely a person who did not have a very elite high-end career. Instead, it was expected that he had somewhat of a menial, ordinary job, maybe not stable employment, but he most likely did not work with his hands. He was somebody who worked at a desk. And I think what he's trying to insinuate is saying that, just someone who maybe didn't have the most stable work life, but he was a desk worker, and the reason why is because the Zodiac created the cryptograms and ciphers, and he put an enormous amount of effort into them. There's a line in Robert Graysmith's book where he says that The Zodiac cryptograms are a work of art. Yes, absolutely, they are very neatly done. The letters are sloppy, but the ciphers are neat. Someone really tried to make all of the symbols very, very neat and arranged in a clean way. However, I don't think, as again, that we have enough information to say that the Zodiac was not somebody who worked with his hands. And you can do both. You can be a desk worker, and you can also be really good with mechanical stuff. It doesn't have to be one or the other. But I mean, this is good stuff, though. These are good questions to ask, and it's good to explore this material. But I also wanted to talk about some of the quotations that people had in the book, because, as I said, it's not only Graysmith's ideas. And the after the murders took place, there was a phone call that was made to the Jim Dunbar show, where some guy using the name Sam says that he is the Zodiac, and he's talking to the attorney Melvin Belli. And Nancy Slover is quoted in the book by saying, "That was absolutely not the Zodiac killer. That person sounded too weak and pathetic." And I agree. I completely agree. That definitely doesn't sound anything like the way the voice has been described from Nancy Slover, from Brian Hartnell, people who actually heard the Zodiac talking. And it sounds like a teenager, more or less, making a prank phone call. And I mean, that's kind of an established story now, but what I think Nancy Slover said, quoting the book again, is that somebody recognized that the Zodiac story was popular and they took advantage of it. Lousy thing to do, but it appears that that's what happened. Now, Melvin Belli is somebody who not received a letter, but I mean, Melvin Belli is someone who is the subject of the Melvin Belli letter that says, "Dear Melvin," and so on, and it contained a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt, and he is the target of this. And Melvin Belli thinks in the book, and he says this, that he thought the Zodiac did that because he was afraid of the death penalty. He thought that the Zodiac did that because he had a moment of awareness and a moment of clarity and realized, oh crap, I killed 5 people and I tried to kill other people. Therefore, I am someone who is going to be facing a lot of trouble down the line. And he was worried that he would be apprehended. So that is the whole reason why Melvin Belli would be pulled into this together. And I think Melvin Belli was thinking more or less that perhaps the phone call could have been real. But the Zodiac killer himself disputed all of that. And we now know this because of the solution to the 340 cipher, which didn't exist at the time in 1986. It wasn't solved until only a couple years ago. And where it says, "That wasn't me on the TV show," which brings up an interesting point about me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber. Oh, I'm sure the Zodiac was afraid of the gas chamber. It's just that he he is just disputing all of this entire that narrative that Melvin Belli has created, that the Zodiac wrote the Melvin Belli letter because he was worried about getting caught and he wanted to set up a defense. Possibly, but I don't think that that's what happened either. And now want to get to some more of your comments here. And we have the Zodiac crimes, the Lake Herman Road murders, the Blue Rock Springs shooting, the Lake Berryessa stabbing, and the Stein murder. And isopropyl benzolamine, I'm sure I mispronounced your name, excuse me, it says, "Ned, I wanted to clarify something around the 14-minute mark in episode 1. In fact, the slightly altered plan of attack at Blue Rock Springs versus Lake Herman Road actually hints at the same perpetrator in both shootings." Okay, gonna stop right there. At Lake Herman Road, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen are murdered on December 20th of 1968, and on July 4th of 1969, Darlene Ferrin is shot and killed, and Mike Mageau is shot, but he lives. And yes, they are very different crimes, but I don't think there's anything that immediately says this has to have been a different shooter. I might have talked about that in part 1, but just because there are differences, it doesn't mean that somebody had to commit the crimes in the same way. But this comment's actually going to continue, and he's going to share some more stuff for us. C. Lake Herman Road, he almost let it get out of hand. When Betty Lou Jensen started running away, he was able to gun her down, as you know, with rapid small-arm fire. He was likely somewhat alarmed just how many times he had to shoot her. He did not want this to happen again at Blue Rock Springs, so he upped his firearm cartridge to a 9mm instead of a .22. At this time, he made almost sure to shoot them both dead without letting Mike Mageau or Darlene Ferrin escape the car. Ah, yes, exactly. Exactly. The more you examine the story, the more it just seems like a single perpetrator is going to be the most likely theory. Somebody committed the Lake Herman Road murders, and for some reason there's that 7-month gap from December all the way to July when the Zodiac's not doing anything. Maybe he was stationed in the military somewhere. And in the 1986 book Zodiac, Graysmith even talks about this. It's like maybe he's a naval guy who's been deployed, or he's going overseas, or he's at the base. And that explains the infrequency in Zodiac activity. Not just military, it says very clearly in the book, maybe he's in the Navy. We, of course, have the naval base at Mare Island, as well as Alameda, California. And from this point, I mean, doesn't that make sense to you? At Lake Herman Road, the victims are ordered out of the car, and then Betty Lou Jensen starts running. I don't know if the Zodiac told her to do that or not, but he may have thought that, okay, this situation could have got out of hand. What is going to be a way to commit murder and not let the situation get out of hand? Shoot the victims while they are still sitting in the car. So I think that that is all just consistent with a single perpetrator. And we have one from Nocturnal Shoegazer who says, "Great idea for episodes, Ned. Arthur Lee Allen always seemed to lack a real motive to me. Even the film Zodiac sidesteps motive, except as it relates to Darlene. Zodiac seemed to have a more purpose. I still think the Zodiac knife and hood is buried under some rock at Lake Berryessa. I need a vacation and a metal detector." Well, that really would be something if the Zodiac were to bury the Lake Berryessa costume, the executioner's hood that he wore on September 27th of 1969. And, as far as Arthur Lee Allen goes, he was a convicted sex offender. He was definitely an unlikable individual. I'm just not convinced that he was the Zodiac, and as I said, you can hear my standalone episode. What I think is much more fascinating about the executioner's hood worn by the Zodiac killer is something discussed in the 1986 book. And again, to respond to that first comment, what are the good things that Robert Graysmith shares? How did the authorities investigate these crimes? Number one, they think, the Zodiac wore the executioner's hood. He's quoting from the operetta, The Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan. He is talking about the lines of the Lord High Executioner in The Mikado in his letters. Okay, should we look for someone who played the Lord High Executioner at one time? Could that hood have been a costume that was actually worn for a production of the Mikado, or at the very least, it's an executioner's hood? And that's one thing they'd like to do. Who once played the Lord High Executioner? The second thing is, the Zodiac talked about having a basement, and immediately they're thinking, not all homes in California have a basement, right? Okay, let's narrow it down. Who is a male between the ages of 20 to 45 who is living in a house with a basement? Eliminate apartments, eliminate mobile homes and trailers. And they're just using all of these tactics to try and narrow down the list and see who is going to fit the mold. And multiple people were interviewed who had been in the production of the Mikado or who had played the role of the Lord High Executioner in the past. And no one was arrested, of course. However, they actually did follow through with this method, according to Graysmith, and he's just like, they went to theaters. They even had a production of the Mikado that was opening after the Stein murder, and, I believe he said when, during one of the crimes, the Mikado was still going through rehearsals. I forget if it was the Stein murder or Lake Berryessa, but that's beside the point. And they're just looking at these theater productions, thinking that the Zodiac might have been a theater guy, and it's quite possible that he was. It just, no one has been arrested, though. And next comment comes to us from Joey Leverton, who says, "Great book, but the epitome of historical fiction." And there's actually a challenge from They Can't All Be Zodiac, who says, well, no, because it's not entirely fiction. And I can throw this to you guys. Do you think that the 1986 book by Graysmith should count as historical fiction because of all of the half-true statements? I would still have to say that it's a true crime book. However, I completely understand this comment, and I also understand the nature of the comment that maybe it's not meant to be 100% literal, that it is historical fiction, or the epitome of historical fiction. It's talking about how, indeed, this is a book with lots of accuracies. Now, in the last episode, I was talking about the Z18 code and the possibility of the Zodiac mailing in his first cryptogram, the 408 cipher, and it's divided into 3 parts. Each part has 136 symbols. The final 18 symbols revealed a nonsensical message. And we have user DB who says, I agree with the Z18. Why wouldn't he just add another set of words? I think it means something. I have to agree as well. You know, at first, I was completely hooked on the idea that the Z18 code was just filler because it's just to fill spaces so they all have 136 symbols. But I even began to count some things out, like you could make a sentence with 18 symbols and just add something in the Zodiac's language. I like killing people or something like that. Use the esoteric Zodiac language. It would be extremely easy for somebody to do if they were already using the method. And it's quite possible the Z18 does have a real meaning. And our next comment comes to us from Mike Hook, who has a comment about the Stein murder, the murder of Paul Stein on October 11th of 1969, and he says, Paul Stein's killer was not Anglo, he was an Arab. This is the theory that Paul Stein, the taxi driver, was murdered by an individual named Hesham Zayed, who was Jordanian, and I heard once that he was a Christian Arab, although I haven't read anything that has completely confirmed that, but Hesham Zayed was a suspect in the Stein murder. But the composite sketches, the famous composite sketches after the Stein murder with the glasses and the crew cut, to me, that person does not look Arab at all. That person does not resemble anyone with Arab features, and I mean, maybe that's not fair of me to say, but I think that the Zodiac was Caucasian. I think the murderer of Paul Stein was he uses the word Anglo. I'm not necessarily going to say that, but let's say of Northern European descent, maybe Western European descent, and more or less I think that the Zodiac was not an Arab. I used to entertain that theory in the past, but not that much. And there's a follow-up comment from Mike Cook that says, I'm no pusher, I never have pushed, from Travis Bickle. Travis Bickle was a man ahead of his time, Robert De Niro's character in Taxi Driver. I love that movie. And our next comment is going to come to us from Aaron Aragon here, and he says, say what you want about Graysmith's book, The Man Started It All. They can't all be Zodiac challenges him by saying, and where did he get his information? Okay, I'm going to use that one first. Robert Graysmith got his information from the files, and he started work on the book in 1972, as I understand. And if you watch the Fincher film, you'll see Jake Gyllenhaal playing Robert Graysmith, and he just has boxes and boxes of Zodiac files. And it's widely accepted that that's true, that that's accurate. Graysmith had access to the reports. He used to go and have coffee with the detectives, and he was someone who lived during the time when this was happening. He had the opportunity to talk to so many people, but at some time between 1972 and 1986, he began fudging the facts. Because to answer that question again, is the Zodiac book historical fiction or is it true crime? I mean, it's a book of fudged facts. I think that's the most accurate way of putting it. And it's one where he knew better. This is the stuff that Thomas Horn really gets on Graysmith for in the this Great Zodiac Killer hoax of 1986, when he's like, Robert Graysmith did all of this deliberately. I mean, he had access to the reports, and then he began changing facts to suit the narrative. And people just speculate about this until the cows come home, saying maybe he wanted to write a better story, maybe he wanted to do this because he was under pressure from the publisher, maybe he thought it would be a better selling book. It could have also been done for profit in that respect. But one point that was brought up by Mark Hewitt, who's the author of Hunted, Profiled, and Exposed, where he said that Graysmith also was not using an electronic database. If he just has a bunch of files that are around, not everybody memorizes all the information, and he might have made genuine mistakes because of that, because of errors in his research. And Aaron Aragon has his own response to where did Robert Graysmith get his information, and he said, who gives a something? The man ushered in a cottage industry of Zodiac crime fanatics, experts, and pundits. Graysmith is a genius. Well, if you mean having one of the most drastic career changes ever, yeah, he was very smart in that way. And Graysmith turned himself in from being a production assistant and editorial cartoonist into a full-time writer and writing all types of true crime books. I mean, Graysmith has written so many books, I can't even begin to count them all. Talking about Jack the Ripper, talking about the murder of Bob Crane, talking about the murder of Myra Davis, all types of different stories. And I think that we have to accept that most of his writings are going to be done for entertainment, but here's something else, and this is perhaps even more important. I completely agree with the person who once wrote out, Robert Graysmith was not expecting the internet to function in the way that it was. Like back in 1986, it probably wasn't even on his mental radar. And he also expected that the case files would not have been made available to the general public. Having something like ZodiacKiller.com where police reports can just be put on a website and people can look at them and people could fact check the book. He was not anticipating that. And I think that that's more or less what happened. So ultimately, you have to give credit where credit is due, but then I don't think there's anything wrong with people like Thomas Horn calling Robert Graysmith a liar, because in many ways, he is. The next comment comes to us from Joe MC, who's responding to something that I asked you guys in part 1. There was the Lake Berryessa stabbing where the Zodiac's wearing the executioner's hood, and then after he left the victims, he walked to Brian Hartnell's car door, and he wrote a message on it in a felt-tip pen. And I said, how did the Zodiac know that the car would be light-colored? And did he also carry a white marker or a lighter-colored marker if the car were dark-colored? And what Joe says, maybe he just would have written on the windows. Yeah, totally. Totally, he could have written the same message with the black felt tip pen on the window. I think that's a reasonable thing to think about. And here we have one from Smoking Kills Oswald, who says, Graysmith's book was great at the time. Of course it's easy to pick it apart years later. We have no prints and no DNA as far as I'm aware, so sadly I don't think we will ever find out who he was. He might very well be right, Smoking Kills Oswald, because Robert Graysmith wrote a book that captivated the audiences, and it has done so for years, for decades. However, I don't believe we have the Zodiac Killer's DNA either, and even stated in the first part, in part 1 of this book discussion, Robert Graysmith is openly expressing his own doubts as to whether or not they have the Zodiac Killer's fingerprints. Multiple times in the 1986 book, Graysmith is talking about how the Zodiac did provide an explanation as to why he had not left fingerprints. It's just 2 coats of airplane cement on his fingertips. He's not actually leaving them behind, even with a partial fingerprint. Let's say, hypothetically, if he did leave one behind, how valuable would that be? And you think about so many suspects, like Arthur Lee Allen, for example. Of course they had his fingerprints. I mean, he was a criminal. And, I mean, DNA is going to be something that is also questionable. And, I mean, Graysmith also talks about this in the 1986 book, thinking that the Zodiac is very methodical. You can debate whether or not he was a genius or something like that. Some people think he was a genius, other people think that he was a dumb guy who got lucky, but he was methodical. I already said the stuff about the composition of the ciphers. Yes, there's a lot of effort that went into those, but also you have somebody who is trying to not leave evidence behind, and he definitely would have been aware about fingerprints. And Robert Grace was saying, now, did he handle the paper in the envelopes while he was wearing gloves? Kind of just asking that as a question. And my response is, I don't know, but I've thought about that. I've absolutely thought about that. And that's why they aren't able to lift side palm prints, also known as writer's palm. And I think that that's definitely something that's worth considering. And our next comment comes to us from Joel Mahan, who says, at Lake Herman Road, the warning shots might have just been missed shots at Betty Lou Jensen as she was running away, and the 6-month period after the Lake Herman Road murders might have been when the Zodiac Killer came up with the Zodiac identity. I go back and forth on this one. Firstly, to provide some context, I was talking about how Robert Graysmith believed that the Zodiac Killer fired a warning shot at Lake Herman Road and it went through the back windshield. And I mean, it's something to think about. Of course, not 100% sure, but what's more important here is, did the Zodiac Killer decide that he was going to be the Zodiac after the Lake Herman Road murders? Was it before? Was this all just planned and calculated? Were the dates just chosen arbitrarily? What exactly happened? And I've said in this and some other episodes, I think that the Zodiac was inspired by Jack the Ripper, where he announced his debut after the second crime. And Jack the Ripper's first letter came after the second crime as well, the Dear Boss letter. And I also said that I believed that the Zodiac chose the letter Z first, and he had this in his mind, that he was going to be a serial killer called Z, which was taken from the story Signed Z by Edwin Baird. Now, did he know that on December 20th of 1968? I have encountered every possible theory out there in regards to that. Some people think that the Zodiac was a prolific serial killer who started committing murders in 1962, and then for some reason, he had some type of experience or some type of event that made him want to give a name to the persona, and he wanted to start calling himself Zodiac for a handful of times because I mean, Robert Graysmith talks about this so much in the book, looking at how the Zodiac says that he is no longer going to announce his crimes. This is what opens the door for the speculation, and the Zodiac might have been committing murders well into the 1980s, and so to speak. And how do you really know when the Zodiac first started and when he didn't, when he stopped killing? It's all part of the mystery. But one thing that is discussed in the book is, well, that narrative is disputed by someone, and that's Melvin Belli. Melvin Belli was thinking that the Zodiac did not commit any murders after Paul Stein, because he's like, again, the Zodiac had a moment of awareness, realized what he was doing, and he thought that all of those, more or less, claims to committing the crimes were not accurate, because he thought that the Zodiac realized that if he kept doing that he would get caught, and countless people have thought about that. They're like, the Zodiac stopped after the Stein murder because he became so close to getting captured. The only reason why we don't have the Zodiac killer in custody right now is because they put an all-points bulletin to be on the lookout for a black man, and in reality, the white man walked right past two police officers. That's mostly it. I mean, yes, the Zodiac also did some methodical things, and he was most likely a sociopath or psychopath because he was able to leave the taxi cab so quickly, as well as not showing any signs of being someone who had just committed a murder, just so smoothly and briskly, walking cool as a cucumber. And Brian Hartnell also said this stuff. This is in one of the earlier parts of the book when he's talking about how he's been stabbed by the Zodiac killer. And just when the Zodiac's walking toward them and walking away from them, he's not even like having the smallest amount of hurried nature in his stride. He is almost certainly a sociopath. But the Zodiac killer was shaking at Lake Berryessa when he was tying up the victims. I mean, Cecilia Shepard tied up Brian's hands, but the Zodiac checked Brian Hartnell's restraints, and at one point he was shaking, and he said, "Are you nervous?" I mean, Brian Hartnell said that to the Zodiac, "Are you nervous?" And then the Zodiac saying, "Yeah, I guess so," and Brian says, "I would be nervous too." So he's not completely cool, calm, and collected all the time, but when he's walking to the crime scenes and leaving them, he's mostly under control and not going to alarm anyone as he walks past them. In conclusion for this episode, I want to know what you guys think. What do you think about these major points? Do you think that that was an effective way of trying to narrow down the killer without DNA and fingerprints, looking at people who had been involved with productions of the Mikado, looking at people who owned a house with a basement or lived in a house with a basement? Do you think that that type of narrowing down all of the points based on the content of the Zodiac letters, just saying who would know this stuff, who would be talking about this stuff, just narrowing all of that down? Number two, do you think the Zodiac had an engineering background? And no right or wrong answers, it's an unsolved case. Put anything you want in the comment section down below. The final question that I have for you guys is, do you believe that Robert Graysmith should be viewed as a hero or a villain? Is he a good actor or a bad actor? And yes, I'm using those terms metaphorically, but you get the idea. Should we think highly of Robert Graysmith or not highly? Please put your ideas in the comment section down below. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there's always BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram. And buymeacoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88. That allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And for now, until next time.